Following the end of World War II, many white Americans began to raise concerns about population control. These individuals, blinded by extreme racial prejudice, blamed immigrants and the poor, who they eventually turned into targets for eugenic practices. Eugenicists essentially believed that certain medical procedures would improve the genetic composition of the human race by eliminating people carrying undesirable traits or restricting their ability to pass on those traits to future generations. Many of these targets were Mexican-American women, who they described as promiscuous and hyper-fertile, and who bred like rabbits and ate up money on welfare. According to Dr. Bernard Rosenfeld, a former resident at County-USC Hospital in Los Angeles, a huge influx of federal dollars for family planning to many hospitals after World War II led 20 to 30% of physicians at County-USC to actively push sterilization on women who either did not understand what was happening to them or who had not been given all the facts regarding their options. In 1974, Rosenfeld gave a list of 180 women, primarily with Spanish surnames, who had been sterilized after childbirth to Antonia Hernandez, a young Chicana lawyer. When interviewing these women, Hernandez found that they were all sterilized under questionable circumstances at County-USC. Many lacked accurate knowledge about sterilization and other forms of birth control, were under heavy anesthesia and did not remember signing consent forms, were told their babies would die if they did not undergo sterilization, were not given consent forms in their native language, Spanish, or were sterilized without any consent procedure at all. Eventually, Hernandez convinced 10 women to file a class action lawsuit in June 1975 against the chairman of the Medical Center's Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, 9 other doctors, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and the California State Department of Health. These women, nicknamed the Madrigal 10 after Dolores Madrigal, one of the victims, were thus part of an effort to revise and add to county, state, and federal guidelines on consent procedures for sterilization. Ultimately, the case's initial trial judge sided with the women and ordered the California Department of Health to rewrite Spanish-language sterilization consent forms at a 6th grade reading level. However, the damages phase of the case was handed over to U.S. District Court Judge Jesse W. Curtis, a 70-year-old Nixon appointee who, on July 1, 1978, decided the women were not entitled to any financial compensation. How did Judge Curtis come to this decision? A deeper investigation into the text of his final opinion helps illuminate Curtis's racist, sexist, and classist logic that no doubt influenced his decision and ultimately conveyed his desire to victim blame, rather than accept the pervasiveness of prejudice at County-USC. First, Judge Curtis's opinion attacked the language barrier between the physicians and the victims. When these barriers exist, Curtis wrote, misunderstandings are bound to occur. Each case is essentially the result of a breakdown in communication between the patients and the doctors. By labeling the sterilizations as misunderstandings, Judge Curtis disregarded the doctors' lies and coercive tactics, like putting the victims under anesthesia before asking for consent or refusing to administer pain medication until they consented. Later, he more explicitly blamed the victims for the language barrier. One can sympathize with the victims for their inability to communicate clearly, but one can hardly blame the doctors for relying on these indicia of consent, which appeared to be unequivocal on their face, he wrote. In Judge Curtis's eyes, the cause of the misunderstandings was the women's inability to communicate in English, and because they spoke a different language from the physicians, it was their responsibility to ensure that the doctors understood them. According to Judge Curtis's racist logic, their cultural difference was the basis for their mistreatment at the hands of doctors who, as trained professionals, should have acknowledged that the victims, for a variety of reasons, were not capable of consenting. Judge Curtis then went on to defend the physicians and their superior judgment. In his opinion, he indicated that he was thoroughly convinced that physicians would not perform an operation unless they were certain in their own minds that the patient understood the nature of the operation and was requesting the procedure. Thus, Curtis argued, the attending physician was probably in the best position to make a judgment about consent, since he would be acutely aware of the necessity of having the patient's consent. Judge Curtis seemed to imply that the physician's education and training, and even their gender, as he only referred to physicians as he, were evidence for their superior authority in judging if consent was given. He failed to acknowledge that though physicians were trained to be acutely aware of obtaining consent, it's very likely that they at times abused their power and high status in the hospital hierarchy and in society at large to force women to undergo sterilization. They would have had several motivations for doing so, such as to satisfy the federal grant the hospital had recently received to increase family planning procedures, or to teach young doctors sterilization procedures by having them practice on the victims. The likelihood of this abuse of power becomes greater when reminded of the victims' vulnerable positions as Spanish speakers capable of reading only at a 6th grade level, and as patients experiencing an incredible amount of pain at the time of their procedures. Nevertheless, Judge Curtis neglected to consider the possibility of abuses of power and chose to defend the physicians based on his own classist and sexist feelings about the superiority of their judgment. In the end, Judge Curtis ruled that the Madrigal 10 would not be entitled to any financial compensation. In addition to suffering this financial loss, many found their relationships with their husbands and children deteriorated as a result of the anger and dysfunction brought on by their sterilizations. Guadalupe Acosta's partner, for example, eventually abandoned her and her 2 children after learning she had been sterilized, and after Maria Figueroa's marriage ended as a result of her sterilization, she attempted suicide. They would not suffer from their physical and mental scars in vain, however. The Madrigal case not only prompted health officials to rewrite Spanish-language consent forms, but also inspired later state regulations that required a 72-hour waiting period prior to undergoing sterilization. Overall, the Madrigal 10 helped improve consent procedures for vulnerable populations and prompted important discussions about reproductive rights, prejudice in the medical community, and most importantly, the power of Chicana voices.